Hello and welcome to today's guided reflection webinar on addressing abuse and neglect during COVID-19, the role of clinicians. I'd like to give a special welcome to our 0 to 3 members today. And I'm Julia Yeri, a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm the Director of Military Family Projects here at 0 to 3. Today I'll be your moderator, and I'll be introducing our facilitator, Kathy Maroney, in just a moment. First, we would like to hear from our colleague Yesenia Ocon, who will be familiarizing you with our some of the features of our Zoom webinar platform to help maximize your engagement in today's session. Yesenia?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today on the Zoom platform. Currently, everyone is muted, and this is to help with any background noise. During the webinar, there will be opportunities for questions and answers. This is a guided reflective webinar format and is intended to be interactive. We ask that you raise your hand to speak and I will unmute individuals. Once you have been selected, you will be able to speak to the full audience and presenter. Please make sure to mute yourself after. You are welcome to put any of your questions in the question and answer box, but we ask that any thoughts and reflections should be entered in the chat box. If you look at your chat, right above where you would type your comment, there is a drop-down menu. Please make sure to select to all panelists and participants so that everyone can see all comments and questions that are coming through the chat. If you don't do this, then only the facilitators will be able to see your comments. This webinar is being recorded and all participants will have access to this and any of the recorded webinars in this series. Instructions on how to access the webinar and any accompanying resources will be provided through an email after the webinar. I will now turn it over to Julia Yeri.
Again, welcome everyone. And I just am very excited to say we have participants from all over the world, not just from the United States. And I want to say thank you. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kathy Maroney. She's the Program Director for Infant and Early Child Mental Health here at 0 to 3 in the Professional Development and Workforce Initiative Department. She's going to lead today's facilitation. Kathy holds an MA in clinical psychology and is a licensed professional counselor with over 35 years of clinical, supervisory, and consultation experience. Kathy?
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Yesenia. And welcome again, everyone. I'm watching as so many are coming online today, way beyond what we anticipated. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to kind of welcome everyone in. You might be wondering, what is a guided reflection webinar? And what we're trying to do with this notion is that while we're certainly going to share some facts and updates that we know, we want to honor the fact that this is really a time of unknowns and that it is a good time for those of us who are clinicians and supervisors and program directors to come together and to be able to kind of be in that unknown place and share ideas, concerns, and comments together. Of course, with such a large number of participants, we probably won't get to everyone's comments and thoughts, but we'll be sampling and giving opportunities throughout. And so I hope that, again, that this framework is one that will be a meaningful one for everyone as we go on. So what we're trying to do also is to, have some space to hold our ideas, our concerns, and those shared experience to reflect both on and in the moment on the work that we do, especially on behalf of infants and very young children and their families, and looking particularly today to thinking about how in this atmosphere of restricted interactions, how can we promote resilience and prevent maltreatment and abuse? So again, we will go through and provide some initial information, and then what we will move into toward the end of our webinar is the sharing of 2 case vignettes, which are meant not so much for us to kind of comment on those specific vignettes, but to talk about what resonated with us in our own experiences in some of the things that came up in the vignettes that we're sharing. So we'll talk more about that later. I know that for many of you, carving out time for today's guided reflection webinar has been challenging, and we do appreciate your time. For others, you were, anxiously waiting to hear from your colleagues and to see what news we might have. Some of you will be really attuned to our conversation, and others might find that you are distracted. And that is all right as well. Just your presence on the call and, kind of joining together in this community of learning and reflection is important for us to do nationally. Today's topic, where we're addressing abuse, neglect, talking about domestic violence, is a difficult one. Even in a training like a webinar, we need to have a trauma-informed lens. And so especially so in this current collective crisis that we are all experiencing personally and professionally. So as we move forward, please do take care of yourself. If you need to, have a drink, have something to eat, if you need to stand and stretch, if you even need to kind of leave for a bit and come on back, that is fine. This is a difficult topic during difficult times, and we really appreciate your interest and concern around that. So let's begin. Briefly, these are some of the goals that we have for today's session, including learning how to address some of the risk for abuse and neglect during the pandemic and under especially shelter-in-place conditions. Increasing our awareness of applying the need for reflective practice in our work. And then hopefully gathering some information and tips throughout this webinar and afterwards that you can share with your programs, your supervisees, your colleagues that will really lend to best practices in these uncharted waters. But before we go on, I'd really like to have a chance to get to know you a little bit better. And so we're going to launch a couple of polls to just see who we have on the call today. So Yesenia, if you would put the first one, the first poll asks what your discipline is. Are you a clinician with one of the medical professions, licensed or unlicensed mental health clinician, or are you an other allied professional? So thank you. I see that the poll is coming through. Julia, would you let me know when it looks like the poll has ended and what the results are?
Absolutely. There's quite a few people are voting, and where I'm really pleased. I did have a question. Someone said that they weren't seeing the slides. So I encourage you, if you do not see the slides, please make sure that you try switching your speaker view. And I'm not sure if Yesenia has another suggestion if people are not seeing the slides. I know switching their speaker view, their view may help them be able to see the slide as well as Kathy. So I believe we have most of the people now have voted. We have, for the discipline, we have 5% are in the medical professional, like a pediatrician or psychiatrist or nurse practitioner. 55% of those present are mental health clinicians, and 40% identify as other. And they're writing their different disciplines in the chat box, and we have everything from school counselors, care coordinators, Head Start lead teachers, child welfare emergency service workers. So we have quite a variety of people here on the call today. OT, SLP, family care education coordinator. So quite a group with us today.
Thanks, Julia. And thanks everyone. I wanted to let you know that this is one webinar in a series of 5. And so in addition to this clinical webinar, we are also having next week a webinar for home visiting personnel, the following week for early childhood educators, And then we're having something for child welfare, and finally military and family support services. And so you are welcome to come to more than one of the webinars, and they're, as you know, are all at no cost. And but just to let many of you know that much of the information we're sharing today is going to be focused for clinicians and clinical supervisors. And again, hoping that that will benefit all of you. And if not, you could also choose to come to a different webinar that is more specific to your sector as well. So the next question that I also wanted to have a sense of in terms of who we are, and could you put the next poll up, Yesenia, has to do with your role. So in the poll, are you a director or administrator, a supervisor, a consultant or coach? Other would be, for a clinician providing direct services, but not a supervisory role, or other allied professionals. So if you would just let me know who's there.
I love the variety of people that and the different practices that they have. That people are still putting in. We have attorneys, we have coaches, home visitors. So again, just such a great group of people coming together to learn about this topic, Kathy.
Yeah, no, I'm excited.
So the results of our poll, we have about 9% of the participants are directors or administrators. We have 22% who are supervisors or reflective consultants, and then 69% make up the rest of the group today.
Great. Well, thank you all for chiming in and letting us know who you are and what your backgrounds are. And we're going to continue now with our presentation. Just one more kind of upfront. When we think about what it is that will sustain and nurture our collaboration and cooperation on this call, we want to really develop a sense of community and of a respectful community. And so we've taken the liberty to outline a few things that might be helpful to just keep in mind in our time together today. One is being conscious of time. I'm sure there will be a lot of ideas and discussions, and we want to hear many of them, but given the size of the group, we can't hear everyone, and we may also have to kind of move on from one point so that we're sure that we give enough time to cover all that we've had. But we do want folks to feel that they can speak openly, either using the chat box or using raising your hand, and we can unmute a few people at different points during the presentation. And that's a great way that you can help to share your own experience, your wisdom, and really be helpful to others on the call. We want, again, for you to be able to have some moments where you can just kind of pause and reflect on the content itself and be aware of your own reactions, whether they are physical or what you're thinking or just how you're feeling emotionally. This is an opportunity for us to kind of engage in wondering, and we'll talk more about that later. And finally, so far so good, but we ask your patience with any technological problems that we might be having during the presentation. I know with so many of us now working virtually, we can all sympathize, but I do ask your patience and your forgiveness in advance should we need it. So again, our frame for today's webinar is reflection. And this slide reminds us of some of the elements of reflective practice that are always key in infant and early childhood mental health work. But they hold special significance now in these times and in the context of sheltering in place and social distancing. So when we review some of the case vignettes later and reflect on them, we'll try to remember some of these very important elements of reflection in our own conversations then. So again, we want to think about the notion of holding space, that ability to kind of make space and time to be reflective personally and with our peers and supervisors and supervisees, to really carve out some regular and protected reflective time is so key, and especially now when we are often in crisis and reaction mode, it's more important than ever. Focusing on co-regulation is another key thing that we'll be looking at with some of the data that we have about ways to promote resilience. But in terms of reflection also, it's a way of really helping to promote co-regulation. We want to be increasing our awareness. So self-awareness happens on both, kind of an emotional and a cognitive place, but we also want to be attending to concrete needs as well. It's so important during these times to be able to hold the other in mind. As we switch and, our technologies, our interventions, we're trying to connect with folks. Sometimes we forget to think about, what about the baby? What is that young child experiencing in their life? And how do we kind of hold them in mind as we make our decisions and take action? Again, in terms of reflecting, we also want to be able to co-create opportunities for play and shared experiences, to be a secure base for folks, and to be sure to, nurture and fulfill ourselves. As I said earlier, I want to just acknowledge that while we have some lessons learned in our field from past studies, disasters, what we know about risk and protective factors in general, we are certainly in uncharted waters when it comes to this global pandemic. We might just want to take a moment here and kind of exhale as a large group. Let those feel where your shoulders are, let the tension kind of go in your body a little bit, because again, this is uncharted water and we're not alone. We're joined by our common reality of not knowing and of having to suspend certainty and embrace the need to let go. This slide might be familiar to some of you, as it's one from our 0 to 3 critical competencies for infant toddler educators curriculum. It really captures what we all want to see for our families, children who even under challenging conditions feel secure and safe in the presence of their parents or caregivers. Years ago, I was trained in a program that came from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, called Safe Havens, and kind of the mantra throughout that program was the importance of reminding children, you are safe here, you can play, I will take care of you. So that was the goal, or what we are hoping to achieve is that sense of safety even in adverse situations. But we know that there are many risk factors that impact on young children. These are not new to COVID-19. These are things that we look at in general in terms of risks for abuse and neglect. So what I want to ask is, that as you look over this list of things like parental mental health challenges, caregiver stress, interpersonal violence, substance abuse, lack of controllability, how might the conditions of COVID-19 create or exacerbate risk factors for the families that you serve. You can put some thoughts in the chat box and raise your hand, and Julia will read some of your chats and also unmute one or two folks who have their hand raised.
Just so you know, we have one person whose hand is raised, but unfortunately their system won't allow them to be unmuted, it says. That's just, you know, it's a, what version of Zoom you have. I'm sorry, Blanca, my apologies. I'm wondering if anyone else would like to share. Feel free to just raise your hand. Here we have, let's see. And if you raise your hand, we can unmute your phone and help you to share. As far as comments in the box, I think that one of the things that people are talking about is parents feel overwhelmed from homeschooling several children. And they also say that, has anyone found themselves with days of high energy and your normal self followed by a day that you're just absolutely exhausted? So even for us, our ability to be present is being impacted. And intergenerational trauma, and then perhaps being together. A roller coaster of high energy to exhaustion, I think is primarily a lot of things regarding that. So, and lack of resources, you know, what do you do for resources when people are home? So those are some of the comments, Kathy.
Great. And I did see one too, because I'm able to see some of these. One that also talked about, you know, concerns in terms of intensified racial bias as well. And, you know, I think that's something that we're seeing as well. There had been an influx of kind of anti-Asian stands early on in this virus. You know, I am calling from the New York, New Jersey areas where my home office is. And, you know, because there have been some Hasidic Jewish communities that have not been practicing social distancing, there has been also some anti-Semitic feelings that are kind of emerging in general. And so, you know, being sensitive not only to multi-generational trauma, but to the impact on racial and ethnic biases as well, I think is something that is really important as another risk factor for sure.
Absolutely. And I would like to hear from Claire. She raised her hand, and I'm going to unmute your phone now, Claire, if you'd like to share. Claire, are you still there?
Yes, I just can't find that button. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Claire. We can hear you.
I've been thinking about the sense of abandonment that people have with the scarcity of basic protective resources and food, and how triggering that is in many of the families that we work in.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so again, being able to hold that sense of abandonment and to, you know, and to be conscious of, you know, talking to that in the relationship that you have with that parent or, you know, with the child and family, you know, kind of being able to hold out that you will not abandon them, that things may shift in terms of how you can meet with them. But, you know, to also, you know, try to solidify and show that there are connections there so that it would help with that sense of abandonment. Thank you so much, Claire.
And one more, and then I know that we have to move on, and that's just the issue around our immigrant families with not only do they have fear about what's going on with the COVID-19, but their fear of if they reach out, what does that mean for their risk for deportation? So that is another risk factor.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that, for coming with those experiences and insights. I really appreciate that. So, you know, as we think about some of the increased risks, you know, we know that parental risk, parental stress does increase, during quarantine. And so just in general, it's a well-known fact that the majority of child abuse and neglect reports are with children under the age of 6, and that about 3/4 of those are under the age of 3, and with most deaths or fatalities happening under the age of 1. Most perpetrators are parents or caregivers. And so, we know that, again, now children are at home and isolated from places where they might have had other supports or other eyes on them at this time. And so that increased sense of risk. There are a lot of studies that have pointed to some risks of child maltreatment. Did we see that there is Curtis, Miller, and Berry, for example, did a study in 2000 showing, again, this increased risk for child maltreatment in the context of collective crisis. Other studies have talked about pre-existing risk factors, and some of those are listed here as stressors, and so we'll look at those in a minute. And more recently, Brooks and others this year have begun to try to pull together some preliminary data from this global pandemic. And their preliminary studies are showing that there is significant psychological impact as a result of quarantine that results in negative effects like post-traumatic stress symptoms, confusion, depression, and anger, and that these symptoms are believed to have a long-lasting effect as well. But it is also important to note that the literature is both limited and complex, and reflects also the complexity of the whole issue of child maltreatment and its interplay with protective factors. So we'll keep all of that in mind. But as we look at this slide, we think about the fact that if parents or caregivers have many of these stressors, such as fear of the infection itself, their own frustration, boredom, having inadequate supplies or money, and the stigma around this disease, especially if it's hit the family, that can also lead to the risks that we would see in terms of maltreatment, neglect, mistreatment, meaning also that other than abuse, we might be seeing more significant types of discipline practices. There might be gender-based violence, especially when it comes to girls, and exploitation. And again, we also see risk of, potential separation then from caregivers. So those are all, part of what we're thinking about and holding as we're doing our work with families, is to, understand what is some of the stressors and risks that they're experiencing now. And it will shift our relationship and our treatment with those families. Children under the age of 6 are sensitive to sudden and significant changes in their lives and routines and changes with their caregivers. They see, hear, feel, and touch change and stress in their environments. Children who've had their childcare or early childhood education supports and connections abruptly stopped, they may feel confused, they may miss their peers, their teachers. Play dates have stopped, and in some places access to playgrounds has ended as well. They miss these things. They're angry, they're confused, they're sad, they're irritable, they might be bored. And while they may be glad to be home with their parents or grandparents, they may have to share those people who are still trying to work from home now and manage the child and their older siblings and the homework, right? So they're experiencing all of these changes. Some children may not be able to see their non-custodial parent, or if they're in foster care, they may not be able to see or visit their biological family. They grieve these losses. And many years ago, John Bowlby described that a young child's grief can be seen through behaviors such as protest, tantrums and defiance and arguing, despair or detachment. Children may feel afraid or worried and dysregulated. These experiences and feelings may result in some of the behaviors that we see in the risk stress factors column on this slide. So based on some of those experiences, children may be crying or demanding. They may either more clingy, or perhaps they don't want to be near the adult. They may be bored or confused, may have trouble with sleeping. They may be more aggressive and have tantrums, and you might see regression. And so the parent who we just talked about their stress level, who is fearful and worried and has their own internal preoccupations, is now having to deal with the stress reactions of their young child. And that can escalate into the risks that we see here as far as having self-doubt, feelings of anger or resentment or rage. The child's responses could trigger the parent's own trauma response, perhaps triggering past traumas. Where some parents might become angry and aggressive, others might react to some of these behaviors by just shutting down and withdrawing. And if a child is having problems with sleep, we know that parents will have problems with sleep as well. And the impact of sleep deprivation on how well people can cope is clear. So again, what we're looking at is how can we minimize the escalation of some of these compounded stress in our interactions with young children and their families.
Kathy,
Yeah.
Sierra asked, could something like this cause any form of PTSD?
Absolutely. First of all, we know that a number of folks, are already suffering with PTSD. So it can exacerbate some of the symptoms. And even in cases where the PTSD had kind of gotten more under control, perhaps through your treatment, it can be exacerbated. It can lead to PTSD in the present as well. And even if it's not full blown, some of the studies, as I just mentioned by Brooks, were showing that PTSD-like symptoms, so maybe not the full blown criteria for the diagnosis, but some of those, kind of being just ruminating on that, whatever that trauma is, and fear, kind of re-experiencing the trauma. And we think about families, particularly those who, have lived with, someone who has experienced COVID-19, and perhaps even in the more severe forms, how traumatizing that could be. Thank you for sharing that. So we also want to be sure that one of the things that we're looking at together today is ourselves and the risk factors for our own professional well-being. We are not immune to increased personal problems such as mental health issues ourselves, domestic violence in our families, and substance use and abuse as well. In addition, as helping professionals, we have a high capacity for empathy and feeling with the families which we serve, but that also kind of gives us that increased risk for either something like secondary traumatization, where because we are dealing with the trauma day in and day out of the lives of the people we're there to serve, we may begin to have some of those same trauma symptoms in our own lives. Compassion fatigue, that complete physical and mental exhaustion that happens and permeates one's life after having to attend to the intense needs of others over time, is another variation the type of risk that we have. It's different than secondary traumatization, but it is also, you know, it has just a very strong negative effects on how we are feeling and how we are doing our work. And burnout, that feeling exhausted and cynical after working under conditions of particularly long hours, high intensity, and with limited or changing resources. And so all of those risks are really high. And for those of you who, you know, talked about, you know, being in roles of directors and of supervisors, the importance of also, again, carving out that reflective time with your staff to just be aware of signals that some of these things might be coming up with some of your staff, and really trying to address them early on before you really, you know, then begin to lose staff and lose the quality of the services that you're providing. For those of you who are providing direct clinical services, that personal reflection and being self-aware of, you know, how you're feeling and when you need to take some breaks and to do some personal self-care becomes really critical. So again, we're going to explore some of these issues later when we reflect on a case that really depicts a clinician dealing with intense case and having other personal concerns impacting their life. So before we continue with the next couple of slides, we want to check with all of you too about whether your program or organization, or you're in private practice, you can respond as well, is currently encouraging clinicians. So Yesenia, do we have another poll for this? Thank you. So what we want to see are if you're being primarily working from home, working on site but using social distancing measures, or some combination of the above.
And while people are completing the poll, I just wanted to say that that last bit was really resonating with people and talking about how hard it is to, now that they're at home, separate work from home and how it bleeds into itself. And that's one of the issues of setting those boundaries. And also just, you know, how hard it is when they don't have access to that face-to-face. Some are blinded and have to use telephone, and just how it's like working with your hands tied behind her back and blindfolded. Yeah. So a lot of talk about that. So I just wanted to kind of point a couple of those out. The polling is completed. We have 78% of us are working remotely from home. About 5% are still working on site using social distancing measures, and 17% are using a combination or some other means of working with their families.
Great. Thank you again, everyone. So what we're looking at here is we're going to take a look at some of the pros and cons when we're working both through social distancing, even though many of you are not doing that, some of you doing a little bit of both. And to think too about, you know, again, what are some of the things that we know are cons. So, you know, again, this notion of, well, we are continuing that face-to-face personal experience in 3D. So there's that semblance of normal, even though the distancing and some of the, you know, perhaps equipment that's being used is changing the nature. You still are perhaps, again, more able to focus on the parent-child interaction with less perhaps either interruptions or limitations that some of that virtual telehealth kind of connection would pose. So again, in terms of cons though, in trying to work this way, it is logistically challenging to make that space, especially when we're talking about families with toddlers. Social distancing in toddlers does not work. But, you know, that trying to create that space, trying to protect is important for yourself and for those families. We could also see that because of some of the things that had to be engineered in social distancing, that could also disrupt the level of engagement that you have. And it could also lead to anxiety about the possibility of contamination. And so that could interfere with the interaction and may result in, you know, just no-shows and cancellations, things like that. So those are all, you know, some things that we were looking at with regard to social distancing. In terms of virtual interactions, and this slide is largely kind of speaking to telehealth or Zoom type platforms, but we also recognize that virtual interventions involve phone interactions as well, and text, and for many email. So there are a number of virtual platforms that are being used at this time, and some more effectively than others. I think as a group, a lot of us heard, especially earlier on, that many were surprised that some of the virtual interventions, video conferencing type of interventions, were as effective as they were. There was some silver linings in what we were doing. We were keeping those connections, less cancellations because people were less afraid to just log on, or they didn't have to travel anywhere. It did give you a chance to look into the home environment, although we'll talk about some of that as well as the limitations. Maybe you were able to see other family members that you've been trying to have come to the office, but because of work schedules and things, you couldn't see or talk to them before. And so you might have an opportunity to connect with more family members and to see the family interact in a different way and in their own home. Can bring a lot to our clinical understanding. In terms of that clinical understanding, you know, we could also do some sharing of screening tools, you know, through email, for example, so that people can kind of, you know, complete some of those screening tools if we have some concerns for example, parental stress or something like that. Some families feel a little more free to share some of their concerns because you are behind a screen and not there in person. And so that might be a plus that comes out of some of your experiences. But some of the cons are, you know, the two-dimensionality. It lacks something in terms of that in-person quality. And the longer that people are using it, many of us are now kind of feeling that we're just tired of the screen. We're using it not only for our work, but for our family, for our friends. And so the screen becomes something that no longer has the appeal that it might have had initially. While we do have perhaps the ability to look into the home environment, there's a limited visual scope. And so unless we're kind of savvy and our families are willing to show us other parts of their room, of themselves, of the child with them, we have this limited scope. We might have problems in the use of the technology. And while HIPAA restrictions have been lightened during this time, we are always concerned about confidentiality risks with families using some new technology. So let me just pause here and just see if, Julia, you wouldn't mind reading a few of the things that are popping up from people who are kind of relating their experiences with virtual interactions.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things you mentioned, people had already captured some of it, like the problem with access to technology. Some people live in very remote areas and perhaps they don't have access to the kind of bandwidth that's necessary, which makes telehealth much more complicated, or their families don't have access to it, which makes it more complicated. Several folks said that they are limited to just audio, just the old-fashioned telephone, and are finding that very challenging. And if I could chime in a little bit, another group of folks that we're working with, same thing, they're limited to just telephone, and we talked about putting the phone on, asking the parent to put the phone on speaker and putting it down, and then coaching them through playing and engaging and singing songs with a child, and how well it has worked, in spite of the fact that it has obviously many limitations. But that's a challenge, just to use audio. So they're talking a lot about that. They are talking about less cancellations, but this feeling of that they have to be more prepared and have everything right there in front of them at the screen, and that it's actually kind of stressful for them as they're trying to get ready for the session, making sure that they have everything they need, and not being able to be as go with the flow. So there's some comments about that too. So
Great.
Those are just the highlights.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, folks. And I did see a few as they were strolling through too, that had to do with, you know, some of the challenges of doing this technology with children on the autism spectrum, and, you know, needing to kind of be bigger than life in really trying to grab people's attention when you're live on camera. So, you know, again, in terms of providing some of this virtual psychotherapy and clinical support, you know, just what we've been seeing as we researched, and I'm sure many of you have done, you know, sites like the American Psychological Association, National Association of Social Workers, American Counseling Association, and others, that we saw some similar guidelines from those sites around, you know, successful telehealth types of meetings. So, you know, first of all, that there is recognition that recipients are receiving this type of care in their homes, and so, you know, we're planning for that. We want to be cognizant of the HIPAA restrictions and confidentiality regulations. And even though some of those, again, have been lessened, you know, be aware of what they might be. We want to acknowledge, you know, again, what are the phone and web capabilities and restrictions? So, you know, people talked about phone not being able to see the person, but the other thing with phone that we have to be considerate of is, and these become equity issues as well, you know, who has and who doesn't have, who has access to laptops or tablets, who has minutes on their phone for your session or for texting. You know, these all become issues. And, you know, in many cases currently, programs and states are often trying to supply clients with the technology, but it often takes a while for that to roll out. And so while that's kind of catching up, you know, we're all in a place of doing the best we can with what we have. And that goes for the families as well. It's important that you check your malpractice coverage, both at an organizational level and at a personal level, in terms of the provision of virtual services. And again, for most telehealth services, the billing is remaining the same as in person, but that's using the video conferencing. That's not always the same for phone consults. So you need to kind of check that in your area as well. This is just a table from the Center for Medicare Services, the CMS.gov website. And again, it just shows you that the coverage for telehealth visits and check-ins and some coding. So there's you know, some material that you can find there to bill for those visits. So recalling our earlier slides on risks of abuse and neglect for children during crisis and the pandemic, the content here aligns with those risks in kind of providing us some basic guidance on mitigating a risk and promoting protective factors. So, what we want to look at, for example, that, during crisis, we need to kind of adjust our relationship so that we are moving more into like a disaster response mode, more into that psychological first aid. So our progress toward our original treatment plan may need to kind of be put on a burner, and as we're just helping people to navigate this new normal and getting them stabilized and regulated. I mean, we want to consider some trauma-informed, evidence-based practices like child-parent psychotherapy or attachment and behavioral catch-up. I've heard from some clinician colleagues that when they changed to telehealth, that it was pretty easy for them to continue with PCIT interventions in the telehealth world. So that was, a nice thing to hear in terms of some feedback. We also might, again, look at increased use of kind of mindfulness, although being trauma sensitive when it comes to some mindfulness practices, or use of creative therapies like music, movement, or play. So those are some things certainly that we want to think about as we're shifting into our mode to help to kind of stabilize the family. Now is not the time to kind of dig deeper and make bigger changes in family life, but to really kind of stabilize and then move slowly toward some of the goals you may have had before. Again, looking to try to create a sense of predictability wherever possible. It's also important to be cognizant of who is present in the same location. It can definitely be an advantage that we are now seeing not only the parent and the one child perhaps that you were working with in a dyadic relationship, but other siblings and maybe other relatives. But you also want to be cognizant of what that means in terms of privacy and sharing, especially if there's risk of danger. And so creating a safety plan, or perhaps designating a safe word, or allowing, agreeing to maybe only talk by phone with someone as part of your intervention if they really need to talk privately with you. These are all some things that we can begin to put into place that will help to kind of minimize those risks. We want to look and listen for signs of frustration, anger, dissociation, or fear. And so it's really important that we have a glimpse at looking at that child, looking how the interaction looks, noticing anything like injuries or bruises or cuts, looking to see if there's flinching or fear, so that we're beginning to get that visual picture as well. And that if we are not doing telehealth, that we're asking about how people are doing, if there has been, if tensions are high, has there been, angry outbursts or anything like that in the home. So similarly, we want to be sure that, just thinking about Maslow's, hierarchy, right? That people can't really invest in our therapeutic interventions unless their health and safety and food and housing is secure. So we want to really check on the status of their basic needs and supplies. As I said, we want to look into that household where we can provide hotlines, and there's some on this slide. You'll be getting some resources with additional hotlines and warm lines as well, so that people can reach out before a problem starts and get some support. But we are still, obligated to report suspicions of neglect or abuse to those state child serving child welfare agencies as well. So before we go on to the case study, any kind of comments or reflections on what we've covered up to now?
Kathy, there was one comment from Kizzy, who's a home visitor She says it's really hard right now because she has several families who don't have internet services or even a working phone number. So trying to get in touch with them has just been impossible. And that she herself lives in a rural area, so her access to technology, internet services has been really hit or miss. So it really kind of raises her anxiety level as well because she can't get a hold of her families. And so that has been problematic. So I don't know if you want to speak to that for just real briefly, and then I can share a couple of these other things with you.
I'm just going to respond to that one, Julia, because looking at our time, I want to be sure we cover the case vignettes, and I think the second one will kind of dovetail on what you've just brought up. But you know, I just feel for you in terms of being in that situation where you don't have the control to be in that therapeutic, helpful role that you so want to be. And, you know, we grieve those losses in our professional selves as well during these times, and bear kind of the burden sometimes of guilt or shame, almost a survivor's guilt that can come up. And so, you know, looking within the program to see, you know, what are some of the alternatives that could be brought to bear, are things that, you know, you can potentially look into. But unfortunately, there are things, situations that are sometimes going to be outside of our control. And it is a terrible feeling of kind of helplessness. But you're not alone in that. And I think that, you know, just recognizing that that this is something that we're all potentially in a place to deal with at one time or another during this crisis. So thank you for bringing that up, because you're not the only person who I'm sure has experienced that and feels that that grief and that fear that comes up.
And I think to dovetail with that is many have chatted that reports of child maltreatment are down by 50%.
Yes.
And of course, we all know that this is a red flag. It's not a good thing. We don't believe it's because there's less abuse. And so all of us are holding that as well. So that's
it's the invisibility, right? Absolutely. So what we're going to do now is going to shift into two vignettes. And I'll ask Julia if she would read the first one, and you have some highlights from what she's reading on the slide above. And then we're going to move to do some reflected questions that, you know, we'd like to hear from you on. So Julia, would you tell us a little bit about the Nelson family?
Sure. The Nelson family were recently referred by their pediatrician, who's expressed concerns about family stability and risk for potential maltreatment. And the pediatrician expressed concern that mom, or Karen, seemed depressed and totally disconnected with her 9-month-old son, Sam. Also, the pediatrician observed that Karen seemed like she'd given up trying to manage the behaviors of her 3-year-old daughter, Isabel, who ran in circles like a cyclone during the well-child visit. Angela is a relatively new clinician who has some training in infant early child mental health and has been assigned to this case. Karen is a Caucasian woman with a high school education who was employed as a hairstylist until she was let go due to COVID-19 and the social distancing restrictions. She lives alone with the 2 children and notes that she and the children's father broke up during her last pregnancy. She's raising the children alone. Karen was only seen once in the office for a brief intake visit. Shortly after, her agency made the decision to temporarily prohibit in-person visits due to the COVID-19. And so Angela reached out to Karen to see if they could, you know, connect via a video platform. But Karen said it seemed just too complicated and that she just wanted to talk by phone. So Karen shared that she was unable to go to work, that childcare was closed, and that she's running out of groceries for the kids. On a recent phone session, the therapist can hear Isabel running into mom's room and complaining that she's bored. When mom doesn't respond, Isabel starts to yell and wakes up Sam from his nap. Karen, who had put the phone down to pick up Sam from his crib, comes back to the phone and says, I don't know how to keep them entertained, and neither of them are sleeping well, and I'm just exhausted. Angela can hear Karen starting to cry. She asks to be put on speakerphone so that Karen can hold and comfort Sam, and so that Karen can also feel free to move about more easily as she spoke. She gently told Karen that it's okay to cry and that she was there to listen. After a few moments, Karen confessed that she was at her wit's end. Angela began to ask her about how she copes when she feels like this, validating her feelings and some of the choices for self-care. She asked whether Karen had felt like striking either of the children, and Karen said that she doesn't hit the children or scream at them, but she just shuts down and doesn't want to deal with them, and she'll shut herself away in her room. Angela wonders about the risk of potential neglect.
So our purpose in using the case example you just heard is not to give advice on this specific vignette, but rather use some of the issues, experiences, and associated feelings that this vignette conveyed for you in our shared discussion. So on the slide, you see a couple of prompts that may help you to kind of respond. Did this scenario, what associations, did it resonate at all with experiences you've had? What feelings or reactions did you personally feel as you were listening? And are there any ideas that you have in response to this or wonderings about the situation? So again, you know, the suggestion is here, we'll take just a few minutes to put some of your reflections in that chat box, and would like to hear from at least one or two folks on the open line if we can.
So if anyone would like to share their thoughts via the phone, feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute your line. If anyone would like to talk. We have a couple things. I wonder about her support system. I wonder about her mental health supports. Basic needs for sleep and food would be a solid need. Also resonated with some of her sessions this week. I feel overwhelmed hearing about the mothers feeling overwhelmed, and it makes it hard to think about how to support her over the telephone. And she really feels like she needs to ground herself before she could really then try and support mom. I think one of the things of wondering if she's being emotionally available for her own children that's resonate. Like, is she shutting down? Am I doing that to my own kids? And you know, what are the parallels there that might be going on? And a lot of sympathy for this mother, and wondering where are her other support systems? You know, does she have any? So a lot of wondering about that. I don't see any hands raised for anyone who would like to speak. One of the questions was if mom could potentially have additional check-ins by phone just to remain connected, if that would be important. And really, Kara says that it seems like this scenario is so similar to so many of the families that she's supporting.
So I just saw one other one that just came through too, Julia, about maybe trying to send a care package for the 3-year-old as a way of just kind of, you know, engaging and helping with some of that. And so those are kind of ideas that, you know, we can think about too, is, you know, that's outside the norm and maybe outside what we were trained in terms of our clinical disciplines, as, you know, with kind of some rules around gift giving and things, that at this time, you know, being able to provide, you know, again, to help with some basic basic needs, which for children could include some, food or cookies or, a coloring book or something, can also help with the family. So again, it may make us rethink some of those positions of being a little bit more objective and think about what the family is needing right now. So I see lots of good responses and folks responding to each other, but I'm going to move us ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
We had one person who just said, Cindy, do you want to say something?
Oh, yes, thank you. Cindy, go ahead. Yesenia, can you unmute Cindy?
Unmute myself. I have the power. Hi, everyone.
Yay. You may need to speak up just a bit louder, Cindy.
Okay. Is this a little better?
That's perfect.
My role as mental health consultant, working with home visitors and thinking about my own personal experience during this time and the home visitors I'm working with and their experience and exhaustion and wondering how to best support a mom such as this from the vignette. And I was just wondering, perhaps people could add to the chat, how can I best support a home visitor to recognize what they bring to a phone call, what they bring to a video chat to support a parent who is feeling so overwhelmed and alone? I guess that's my question.
Well, I'm sure folks will begin to respond themselves. Just from a quick response from me is, being self-aware. So first of all, just being aware of what I am bringing in, how I am. So, at 0 to 3, we always quote Jerry Paul on the how you are is as important as what you do. And so, how am I? How am I doing? Am I regulated? Am I ready for this family? Can I keep it together? is one kind of check-in. And as we mentioned earlier, being kind of prepared, maybe even a little over-prepared in terms of, well, what do I surround myself with at my desk that if I'm doing, televisit, I could kind of grab a toy or something that I'm going to engage that child with. How can I be prepared? Being prepared with what are some of the questions that I want to have for them, and with some of the resources, links, phone numbers, locations of, places to get food. Being prepared in those ways are ways to kind of help, really keep that interaction a strong one. Thank you, Cindy, for raising that. I hope that helped address some of your concerns. So I'm going to look at this next scenario, which is focusing on the professional in this case. And so again, Julia, if you could kind of read through kind of quickly, because again, we're coming up on our time, but I would like to get this one in.
Sure. All right, so this is continuing with our previous vignette. It's 3 weeks into the quarantine. Angela's been able to help Karen set up her laptop for teletherapy sessions. She's able to see Karen and the children in the home. Has been able to do quite a lot. She still is concerned. Karen is still in pajamas or sweats when she's taking the calls, and the children are in pajamas or the babies in a diaper and an undershirt. Karen has been able to do some shopping, but she still has very little in the house, and she doesn't feel like cooking, so she's giving the kids peanut butter and jelly and crackers much of the time. Isabel runs around a lot, but she does seem to be interested in the telehealth aspect and likes to show Angela some of her toys and stop and talk. Angela sees Sam as crawling, but stays close to Karen and often clings to her lap. So Angela's using this time to see the whole family and to try and engage each of them and support Karen in her efforts to interact with the kids. She also has been able to connect Karen to a psychiatrist at their agency to assess whether medication would be indicated. But Angela also is a very similar age to Karen, and she also has a 3-year-old at home. And she's finding that she ruminates and worries about Karen and Karen's children. She wakes up at night thinking about them and can't fall back asleep. Her thoughts are going in circles, worrying about each member of the family and seeing them in her mind, imagining worst case scenarios. She feels anxious and sad much of the time at home and during work appointments. Angela feels guilty that her own son is so much easier to deal with than Isabella, and that she has a job and a husband and who's home during the quarantine. Angela finds that she's feeling distracted and numb during some of her therapy sessions with other clients. She's starting to feel confused about what concrete services are available in the community as resources, and how in the world does she help families connect to them. She finds herself teary and crying much of the time. She knows that she needs to discuss the case with her supervisor, but she tends to report on her family only, and is not open to sharing her own reactions and feels. So she's only talking about her cases and not her own feelings or her own reactions. Angela's also called out sick 3 times with migraines over the last 2 weeks.
Thanks, Julia. So again, you know, we have some time to kind of just think about this case scenario. But as you're kind of entering some of your own thoughts, I'm going to, you know, move us ahead to think about some of the things that really came up in that scenario. You know, when we closely identify with our clients, you know, that can be a real risk of losing that sense of boundary and of, you know, I had a colleague who always talked about the fact that, you know, then you have 2 patients and no doctor. So, you know, the ability to really, as we said earlier, and Cynthia brought up, to be aware of ourselves is really important. Having protected time and having a supervisor who will start to wonder about, I'm hearing a lot of details about Karen, I'm not hearing about your other cases, and how are you doing, is, you know, something else that came up here, because Karen, Angela is keeping her own stuff very private. Maybe she's afraid of just being overwhelmed by her own feelings, or maybe she's afraid of being seen as unprofessional, but creating safe spaces where we can explore our own reactions and not carry them into the work, and not become physically sick with migraines or stop working with some of our clients, are all things that, again, we're hoping to do here. So again, I see one note here about, you know, countertransference, you know, from those of us who had some psychoanalytic background being really explored and used, especially in reflective practice, parallel process being examined as part of that process. And that means that we need to be making this time and space for reflection personally and in our supervisory relationships. So moving forward, what are we learning from our conversations and from the field that will help us move forward? You've all given some really great ideas and information early on and throughout this webinar, and in your reactions to our case studies as well. This slide kind of presents some recommendations from recent research that I talked about earlier by Brooks et al. In moving forward under quarantine conditions. Many of his points reaffirm those that we've already talked about or that you've shared with in our conversations. So again, being able to provide as much information as possible in real time. Things change by the hour, and we need to kind of keep up with that. And for those of you who are supervisors and directors, that might be something that is high on your list of priorities, so that as your clinicians are working with the families, you're able to funnel that information to them, and they don't have to go searching for it. You know, providing families and staff with local, national resources and adequate supplies and technology. We have to provide for some flexibility and approach in scheduling and really looking at work-life balance. Prioritizing self-care is something that's really key. So those are all some real key things that we can do. And what I'd like to ask folks to do is just privately, not in the chat box for now. If you have a piece of paper or if you just want to do this in your head, I want you to consider what are some barriers that are in your way to accomplishing some of these steps to move forward? What resources do you need? What supports or practices can you as supervisors or leaders put in place that might help? At 0to3.org, we have a number of resources that you can look into that could be useful to the clinician as well as for the clinician to share with families, and we invite you to explore that site for some of those tools. There are many other things that 0to3 offers as well that you can look at while you're on the website, but I know your interest right now is so focused on COVID-19. The next in our guided reflection webinar series is this workshop for home visitor supervisors and administrators and home visiting staff. It will be next Wednesday, April 22nd from 1 to 2:15 Eastern Standard Time, the same time as this webinar. And Julia, I know there's another webinar that we're doing that's coming up in May. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. You all might want to sign up for this one on May 20th, which is a Wednesday from 3 to 4:15 Eastern Time. Our professional development team, we're going to be putting on a webinar called You Matter, Promoting Professional Resilience During Crisis. And the goal of this webinar really is to provide an opportunity for early childhood professionals like yourselves to learn and reflect together about strategies and resources to support our own professional resilience during and after this current crisis. And as we heard today, I think how critically important that is. So I really think that, you know, that we're on really unfamiliar ground, and really being able to join together and join our expert faculty to talk about this topic, I think that we'll get a lot out of it. So again, you can register at 0to3, May 20th, 3 to 4:15. You Matter, Promoting Professional Resilience During the Crisis.
Okay, thank you, Julia, and thank you, everyone. I know we are a minute past our time today. I really appreciated your input. You will be receiving an email with some links for the recorded webinars and some additional resources. Be well, be safe, and be compassionate with yourself. Take care now. Thank you so much.